Jennifer clutched the old book tightly against her chest, as if it were a lifeline. The worn leather cover felt cool beneath her fingertips, and the edges, frayed from time, brushed against her skin like a whispered reminder of the past. It wasn't just a book, it was her father's last gift to her before he vanished. It carried memories, promises, and secrets she barely understood. But today, it had to become something else, a chance to save her mother. Her breath was shallow, and each step forward felt heavier than the last. Her thoughts circled relentlessly around her mother's fragile body, lying in that tiny bed, fighting to breathe. The medical bills were piling up, and every passing day made it harder to ignore the harsh truth: they needed money now. Selling the book was the only option left. She hesitated in front of a small, dimly lit bookstore sandwiched between two larger buildings. Its sign was cracked, and the windows were lined with dust-covered novels that no one had touched in years. It seemed like the kind of place that might give her something close to what the book was worth. At least, she hoped. As Jennifer stood there, adjusting the weight of the book in her hands, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "How much for the book, kid?" The voice was sharp and low, almost like the scrape of a knife on stone. She turned and saw him, a tall, gaunt man with a slouch that made him seem part of the city's shadows. Victor Blackwood. His eyes glinted with something dark, a mixture of greed and calculation. Jennifer's heart raced, but she forced herself to stand her ground. She wasn't used to talking to strangers, much less ones who exuded danger the way Victor did. But for her mother, she had to try. $50, she said, hoping it sounded like she knew what she was doing. Victor gave a dry chuckle, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. 50? I'll give you 20. That's more than fair. Jennifer's grip on the book tightened. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words stuck in her throat. $20 wouldn't even scratch the surface of what she needed. "It's worth a lot more than that," she muttered, though her voice lacked confidence. Victor stepped closer, towering over her. His breath smelled faintly of tobacco and something bitter, like old coffee. "Look, kid. You won't get a better offer anywhere else. You take the 20, or you get nothing." Jennifer's heart pounded. Panic began to well inside her, but before she could respond, the low hum of an engine reached her ears. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, and a man stepped out. He was tall, with neatly combed black hair and a sharp tailored suit that shimmered slightly under the streetlights. He moved with the kind of ease that only comes from power and wealth. His face was calm, almost too calm, but his eyes were different. There was a sadness there, hidden just beneath the surface, as if he carried a weight that no amount of money could lighten. "Is everything all right here?" the man asked, his voice smooth but firm. Victor shot him a withering glance. "We're in the middle of a deal, friend. No need to stick your nose where it doesn't belong." The man's expression didn't change, though his eyes flicked briefly from Victor to Jennifer. "Actually, I think it is my business." Jennifer blinked, unsure what to make of him. He knelt slightly, bringing himself to her level, and offered a small, reassuring smile. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Jennifer," she whispered. "I'm Michael," the man replied. "May I see the book?" Jennifer hesitated. She didn't know this man, but something about the way he spoke made her feel safe. Slowly, she handed over the book. Michael took it with care, as if it were something fragile and precious. He opened the cover, running his fingers lightly over the yellowed pages. His expression shifted, just a flicker, but Jennifer caught it. He recognized the book's worth, though it was clear to her that it wasn't the monetary value that struck him. "This is a special book," Michael said, almost to himself. Then he looked at her again. "Why are you selling it?" Jennifer lowered her gaze, embarrassed to admit the truth to a stranger. "My mom. She's really sick. I need money for her medicine." Michael's eyes softened. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he stood and turned to Victor, his posture relaxed but resolute. "I'll give you $1,000 for the book." The words hung in the air like a shockwave. Jennifer's breath hitched in disbelief. $1,000? Victor's face twisted with anger. He took a step toward Michael, his fists clenched. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he hissed. "This is my deal. Back off." Michael's gaze didn't waver. "It's not your decision. It's hers." Jennifer stared at both men, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel Victor's fury burning beside her, but Michael's calm presence was like a lifeline. She knew this was a chance she couldn't let slip through her fingers. "I'll take it," she whispered, almost afraid the words might dissolve before they left her mouth. Victor let out a low growl of frustration, but there was nothing more he could do. Michael had won. "Fine," Victor spat. "You'll regret this." He shot one last glare at Jennifer before stalking off into the night, his figure melting back into the city's shadows. Michael reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crisp envelope, handing it to Jennifer. "Here. This should cover what you need." Jennifer took the envelope with trembling hands. It felt heavy, not just with money, but with possibility. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael gave her a small nod. "Come on. Let me give you a ride home." The car was silent except for the soft hum of the engine as it navigated through the streets of New York. Jennifer sat in the passenger seat, the book resting on her lap, her fingers tracing the familiar edges. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope stir in her chest. Michael glanced at her briefly, sensing the weight she carried. "Do you live with just your mom?" he asked quietly. Jennifer nodded, her gaze fixed on the passing city lights. "My dad. He disappeared a few years ago. He was an investigator. He left for work one day and never came back." Michael didn't respond right away, but she could see the shift in his expression. It was subtle, just the barest tightening of his jaw, but it told her he understood loss in a way few people did. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Jennifer looked down at the book in her lap, her heart heavy with both sorrow and something new, something close to hope. She didn't know why, but she felt like meeting Michael wasn't a coincidence. And somehow, she knew this was only the beginning. As Michael pulled up to Jennifer's house, something immediately felt off. He had been in enough dangerous situations to recognize when a place didn't feel right. The front door was ajar, the lock broken. Twisted metal clung to splintered wood like a silent warning. A chill of recognition ran through him. He glanced toward Jennifer in the passenger seat. She was gripping the book tightly again, her knuckles pale. "Stay in the car, Jennifer," Michael instructed, his tone calm but leaving no room for argument. "But stay here," he repeated, firmer this time, meeting her gaze. "I need to check things out first." Reluctantly, Jennifer gave a small nod, but the anxious look on her face told him she wouldn't wait long. Michael exited the car and approached the house with cautious steps. His eyes scanned the entryway and windows for signs of movement. The door swung open with a soft creak as he pushed it. Inside, the house was a wreck, furniture overturned, drawers ripped open, and books scattered across the floor. Whoever had been here wasn't just looking for valuables, they were searching for something specific. Michael's pulse quickened. From the far corner of the living room, a soft, shaky voice broke the silence. "Who's there?" Michael turned toward the sound and saw her, Sarah Johnson, sitting on the floor with her arms wrapped around her knees. She was trembling, her skin pale as wax, and her eyes wide with fear. The exhaustion from her illness was evident, but there was something more. Raw fear lingered in every breath she took. "Mrs. Johnson?" Michael said gently, keeping his voice low as he took a step closer. "Are you all right?" Sarah's gaze locked onto him, her face filled with confusion and panic. "Who are you? Where's Jennifer?" she asked, her voice shaky but edged with urgency. "Jennifer's safe. She's in the car," Michael assured her, stopping a few feet away to give her space. "I'm Michael. I met Jennifer earlier, and I came to help." The tension in Sarah's body loosened, just slightly, but the fear in her eyes remained. At that moment, the front door slammed open. Jennifer burst inside, ignoring Michael's orders. She spotted her mother on the floor and ran to her, falling into her arms. "Mom, I'm here. It's okay, I'm here." Sarah clung to her daughter, the relief in her face mixed with exhaustion. She closed her eyes, holding Jennifer tightly, as if she feared she might vanish too. "Someone broke in, Mom?" Jennifer whispered, looking around the ransacked living room. Sarah nodded slowly. Her breath was uneven, and when she spoke, her voice was hoarse. "A man. He came in. He was desperate. He was looking for something." Michael crouched beside them, his sharp eyes narrowing at Sarah's words. "What did he look like?" he asked gently, though his mind was already racing ahead, piecing together fragments of what he suspected. Sarah took a moment to gather her thoughts, as if every detail brought her closer to the fear she had just experienced. He was tall, bald, wearing a black jacket. She shivered slightly, rubbing her arms. "He tore through everything and then, he left." Didn't even say a word. Michael felt the weight of her description settle in his gut. A tall, bald man in a black jacket. It fit too well with some of the reports he'd been following. Victor. The name rang in Michael's mind like a warning bell. This wasn't a random break-in. It was connected to John Johnson, just like he'd feared. Victor was sniffing around for something, likely the same thing John had been investigating when he vanished. Michael leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. The room felt heavier, the stakes higher. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I need you to tell me everything you know about John's disappearance." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, rubbing her forehead as if the memories themselves were physically painful. "John was working on a big case before he disappeared," she said slowly, her voice quiet but filled with old grief. "He was getting close to something dangerous. Something involving very powerful people." She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the floor as though the words carried too much weight. "He left for work one morning, just like any other day. But he never came home." Jennifer shifted in her mother's arms, watching Michael closely, as if trying to read his thoughts. "Do you know what case he was working on?" Michael pressed. Sarah shook her head weakly. "He didn't tell me much. Just that it was big. And that we'd need to be careful." Michael's jaw tightened. Everything about this situation pointed toward Victor's network. Extortion, kidnapping, and disappearances were all too familiar in the circles John had likely uncovered. And now, the man who had torn through this house was probably one of Victor's men, still searching for something John had left behind. Michael shifted his weight, glancing between Sarah and Jennifer. "You're not safe here," he said finally, his voice firm but calm. "If Victor is involved, and I think he is, you're both in danger." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, fear flashing across her face. "Victor," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You mean, the man John was investigating?" Michael nodded. "Yes. If he thinks there's something here that could expose him, he won't stop until he finds it." Jennifer looked up at Michael, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "What do we do?" Michael's response was immediate. "You come with me. I'll take you somewhere safe, and I'll figure out what's going on." Sarah hesitated, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "We don't have anywhere else to go," she murmured, almost to herself. Michael leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but unwavering. "I'll make sure you're taken care of. But you can't stay here. Not now." Jennifer squeezed her mother's hand, giving her a small, reassuring nod. "Mom, we should go with him." Sarah looked at her daughter, then at the wreckage around them, and finally back at Michael. She could see the seriousness in his expression, the quiet resolve that told her he wasn't making empty promises. After a long moment, Sarah gave a small, reluctant nod. "All right," she whispered. Michael rose to his feet, offering a hand to help Sarah up. Jennifer clutched her book tightly again, glancing one last time at the only home she had ever known. "I'll take you somewhere safe," Michael said, his voice steady. "And I'll find out what happened to John." Jennifer's heart clenched with a strange mixture of fear and hope. For the first time in years, it felt like someone was on their side, someone who might actually be able to help. As Michael led them out of the house, Jennifer cast one last look over her shoulder at the broken doorframe and the chaos inside. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The car ride to the hotel was quiet. Jennifer sat in the back seat with her mother, both of them holding on to the few things they managed to grab before leaving their broken home behind. Michael drove with focus, but his mind was working fast. Victor's involvement was undeniable now, and if John had been on Victor's trail before he disappeared, the Johnsons were in more danger than they realized. Michael knew firsthand how deep Victor's connections ran, and how ruthless the man could be. The hotel Michael chose was discreet, tucked away on a quiet street where few would think to look. It was the kind of place wealthy men used when they wanted to disappear from public view. A place no one asked questions. As soon as they arrived, Michael guided Sarah and Jennifer through the private entrance, bypassing the front desk. He had arranged everything ahead of time. A doctor was already waiting for them in the suite, along with a nurse carrying supplies. "Take care of her," Michael instructed the doctor as they entered the room. Sarah tried to protest, her pride flickering for a moment. "We can't afford." "Don't worry about that," Michael cut in, his voice calm but firm. "It's taken care of." Jennifer held her mother's hand as the nurse helped Sarah into the bed. Her mother's breathing was shallow, her skin pale against the white sheets. Watching her like this, Jennifer felt that same familiar knot tighten in her chest, the helplessness she hated so much. Michael stood silently in the corner, watching as the doctor checked Sarah's vitals. He could see the weight of everything on Jennifer's small shoulders. It was too much for a 12-year-old, yet she carried it with a quiet resilience that reminded him of someone he used to know himself. Once the doctor finished examining Sarah, he pulled Michael aside and spoke in a low voice. "She's weak, but stable. The medication will help, but she needs rest and time to recover. Whatever stress she's under, you need to remove it. Otherwise, it could get worse." Michael gave a curt nod. "Thank you. Stay close in case anything changes." The doctor gathered his things, leaving behind the necessary prescriptions, and exited the room. Michael turned to find Jennifer standing by the window, her small frame almost swallowed by the oversized hoodie she wore. She watched the city outside with a distant expression, lost in thought. He took a breath and crossed the room, stopping beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without looking at him, Jennifer asked the question that had been on her mind since the moment they met. "Why are you helping us?" Michael wasn't surprised by the question. He knew it would come eventually. But even so, it caught him off guard. He took a second, choosing his words carefully. "Because," he said softly, "I know what it's like to be alone. And someone helped me once when I needed it the most." Jennifer finally looked up at him, her blue eyes wide and filled with curiosity. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael gave her a small, sad smile. "That's a story for another time." Jennifer studied him for a long moment, as if trying to peel back the layers he kept so carefully hidden. She saw it in his eyes, the same kind of sadness she felt. The kind that comes from losing something important and never quite getting it back. She gave a small nod, as if to say she understood, even if she didn't know all the details. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice sincere. Michael's chest tightened at her words. He wasn't the kind of man who sought gratitude. But something about Jennifer's quiet appreciation made it feel heavier, more real, than any thank you he'd ever received before. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything settling between them. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and restless nights. Michael worked tirelessly, using every connection he had to gather information. Victor's name kept surfacing, always in the background, like a ghost lurking just out of reach. He spoke to old contacts in law enforcement, private investigators, and informants. The more he uncovered, the clearer the picture became. John Johnson had stumbled onto something dangerous, and Victor was right in the center of it. Michael's instincts told him John was still alive, but if that were true, he was running out of time. Jennifer stayed close to her mother, rarely leaving the room. When she did, it was usually to sit quietly by the window, watching the world outside like it held answers she couldn't quite grasp. Michael noticed how careful she was around her mother, always trying to be strong, hiding her own fear beneath a brave front. One night, after the nurse finished checking on Sarah, Michael found Jennifer sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at her mother as she slept. "She's getting better," he said gently, stepping into the room. Jennifer looked up, her face tired but hopeful. "I think so. But I don't know what's going to happen to us now." Michael sat down in the chair across from her. "We're going to figure this out. I promise." Jennifer hugged her knees to her chest, her voice small. "You think my dad's still alive?" Michael hesitated, not wanting to give her false hope. But he also didn't want to extinguish the little flame of belief that still burned inside her. "I think there's a chance," he said finally. Jennifer nodded slowly, as if she had already made up her mind to believe him, no matter how slim the odds. "Victor knows something, doesn't he?" she asked. Michael's gaze darkened. "Yes. And I'm going to find out exactly what he knows." Late that night, after Jennifer had fallen asleep beside her mother, Michael stood by the window with his phone pressed to his ear. "I need more eyes on Victor," he said quietly into the receiver. "Every place he's been, every contact he's met, track it all. I don't care how long it takes. Just find something." He ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket. He stared out at the city lights, his reflection faint in the glass. In that moment, he made a silent promise. He wouldn't let Jennifer down. He had made too many mistakes in the past. This wouldn't be one of them. As he stood there, the weight of old memories pressed down on him. He had been in Jennifer's shoes once, lost, scared, desperate for someone to care. And someone had saved him back then. Now, it was his turn to do the same. Michael leaned back in the leather chair of his hotel suite, his phone pressed to his ear. Hours of digging through contacts, favors, and classified reports had finally given him what he feared, but also what he hoped. John Johnson was alive. The problem was that John wasn't just missing. He was in Victor's hands, trapped and being forced to give up something valuable. Whatever John knew, Victor was determined to extract it. Michael exhaled through his nose, setting his jaw tight. Time was running out. He knew Victor well enough to understand that when John outlived his usefulness, he wouldn't make it out alive. His contact on the other end of the line lowered his voice. "We got confirmation. He's being held at a warehouse in the industrial district. Tight security. It won't be easy to get in or out." Michael's eyes darkened. It never is. He ended the call and immediately began dialing another number. This time, the line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Detective Rollins." "It's Michael Thompson," Michael said, not wasting time on small talk. "I found him." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a low whistle. "You're telling me John Johnson is alive? And Victor Blackwood's got him?" "Exactly. He's in a warehouse by the docks. I'll text you the coordinates." Rollins swore under his breath. "If Blackwood's involved, you know this won't be a clean operation. The guy's got half the city in his pocket. We'll need to move fast before he gets wind of us." Michael ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. John's the key to taking Victor down. If we lose him, we lose everything. The detective didn't need any more convincing. "I'll pull a team together, but it's going to take time. You sure we can trust the information?" "I am," Michael said with certainty. "But we don't have much time. We move tonight. You do realize what you're getting into, right?" Rollins asked, his voice heavy with warning. "Blackwood won't let John go without a fight. This could get messy." Michael's lips pressed into a hard line. "It already is." After ending the call, Michael checked the time on his watch and sent the coordinates to Rollins. He knew they had a small window of opportunity. Any delay could mean John's life. He stood by the window, his mind running through possible outcomes, each one darker than the last. This wasn't just a rescue mission. If they saved John, they could finally expose Victor and dismantle his entire operation. But if they failed, it wouldn't just be John's life at stake. It would mean the Johnsons would never be safe again. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in." Jennifer stepped inside, her small frame dwarfed by the oversized hoodie she wore. Her eyes were sharp, her gaze steady, but Michael could see the exhaustion creeping beneath her composure. "Did you find anything?" she asked, her voice quiet but determined. Michael hesitated for a moment, debating how much to tell her. But she deserved the truth. "We found your dad." Jennifer's eyes widened. "He's alive." Michael nodded. "Yes. But Victor has him. We're going to get him out tonight." She took a step closer, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I want to come with you." Michael shook his head firmly. "No. It's too dangerous. But he's my dad." "And that's exactly why you need to stay here," Michael interrupted, his voice steady but gentle. "Your mom needs you. If anything happens to me or the team, you're the only one she has left." Jennifer looked like she wanted to argue, but she swallowed her words, her jaw tightening with frustration. She hated feeling helpless, but deep down, she knew Michael was right. "You'll bring him back," she whispered, her voice small. Michael knelt slightly to meet her eye level. "I will. I promise." Jennifer searched his face for any hint of uncertainty, but all she found was resolve. "Okay," she murmured, though the word felt heavy in her mouth. Michael gave her a small nod and stood up. "I'll be back before you know it. Just stay here, take care of your mom." Jennifer wrapped her arms around herself, watching as Michael grabbed his coat and phone. "Be careful," she whispered as he reached the door. He gave her one last glance over his shoulder, the ghost of a smile flickering across his face. "Always." In the hallway, Michael's mind shifted into mission mode. There was no room for fear or hesitation now, only focus. He stepped into the elevator and hit the button for the ground floor, his thoughts narrowing to the task ahead. By the time the door slid open, Rollins was waiting for him in the hotel lobby, dressed in plain clothes but carrying the kind of tension that came before a storm. "You ready for this?" Rollins asked, his eyes sharp. Michael gave a single nod. "Let's go." They exited the hotel and climbed into an unmarked SUV parked at the curb. Rollins drove while Michael went over the details one more time in his head. Every second counted. "We'll approach from two sides," Michael said, laying out the plan. "Your team handles the perimeter. I'll go inside and get John." "You always this reckless," Rollins muttered, though there was a hint of respect in his voice. "Only when it matters," Michael replied. As they neared the industrial district, the city's lights gave way to dark, abandoned warehouses and empty docks. The streets were eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that warned of unseen danger. Rollins pulled the SUV to a stop a block away from the target location. "We do this fast and clean," Rollins said, loading his weapon. "In and out." Michael nodded, his mind already on the objective. John was inside that warehouse, alive but running out of time. This was their only chance to get him out and end Victor's reign once and for all. Michael glanced at the dark silhouette of the warehouse in the distance, a cold determination settling over him. "Let's finish this." The SUV coasted to a silent stop near the dark warehouse. Michael scanned the surroundings while Rollins gave instructions to his team through a secure earpiece. Armed agents moved into position, dispersing into the shadows like ghosts, surrounding the building from every angle. "Remember," Rollins whispered, glancing at his watch. "Quick and quiet. No second chances." Michael checked his weapon and tucked it back under his coat. This wasn't his first operation, but there was more at stake this time. If they failed, John wouldn't survive, and Victor would slip through their fingers again. "On my mark," Rollins said over the comms, signaling his men. Michael shifted his weight, eyes locked on the warehouse entrance. The next few minutes would decide everything. The signal came, and the operation sprang to life. The team moved in like a well-oiled machine, breaching doors and storming in through side entrances. Flashlights swept across crates and metal beams, cutting through the darkness. The air thickened with tension as Michael led the way inside, his senses sharp, listening for the slightest movement. "Perimeter secure," Rollins' voice crackled through the comms. "We're clear outside. Go for the target." Michael nodded, signaling two agents to follow him deeper into the warehouse. They found the first wave of resistance almost immediately, Victor's men, armed and waiting. "Contact," someone shouted. Gunfire exploded in the air, the deafening crack of bullets ricocheting off metal surfaces. Michael and the agents ducked behind crates, returning fire with precision. "We need to move fast," Michael called over the noise, his voice cutting through the chaos. They pushed forward, advancing in bursts. Fire, move, fire again. One of Victor's men fell, then another. The agents covered each other as they weaved through the maze of storage containers and machinery, clearing every corner with ruthless efficiency. Michael's mind was fixed on one thing: John was here somewhere, and they were running out of time. "Check the holding area," Michael ordered, motioning to a set of steel doors at the far end of the room. Rollins' voice came through the comms. "I've got eyes on movement near the exit. Victor might be making a run for it." Michael clenched his jaw. Let him run. Victor would have to wait. John was the priority. He reached the steel doors and kicked them open, revealing a dimly lit room with nothing but a chair, chains, and a slumped figure barely recognizable as John Johnson. "John," Michael called, rushing forward. The man stirred, lifting his head slowly, as if waking from a nightmare. His face was gaunt, cheeks hollow, and his wrists were raw from the cuffs that had kept him restrained. But he was alive. Michael knelt beside him, carefully pulling the chains free. John squinted, his vision blurred, but his eyes locked onto Michael's. "You." John's voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in days. "Why?" Michael gave him a small, reassuring smile. "Because your family needs you." John's breath hitched. For a moment, he seemed too overwhelmed to respond. Then, with a visible effort, he nodded. "Jennifer. Sarah. Are they okay?" "They're safe," Michael answered, lifting John to his feet. "But we need to get you out of here." John staggered, his legs weak from days, maybe weeks, of captivity. Michael wrapped an arm around him, supporting his weight as they moved toward the door. "I've got him," Michael said into the comms. "We're heading out." Gunfire erupted again in the distance. Rollins came through the line, his voice sharp. "Victor's men are putting up a fight near the exit. Move fast, we've got this, but it's getting messy." Michael tightened his grip on John. We'll be out in 30 seconds. The two agents covering their path stayed close, scanning every shadow as they made their way toward the exit. John stumbled more than once, but Michael kept him steady, never slowing. He wasn't about to lose him, not now, not when they were this close. When they reached the main loading dock, the final barrier between them and freedom, a fresh wave of gunfire tore through the air. Michael shoved John behind a stack of crates, drawing his gun as two of Victor's men closed in. "Stay down," Michael ordered John, stepping into the open and firing twice. Both shots hit their marks. The attackers crumpled to the ground. Rollins' voice came through the comms again. "We're clearing the last of them, move now." Michael hauled John to his feet again, and together they pushed through the exit, stumbling into the night air where the SUVs waited. Rollins waved them over, covering their approach with a rifle. "Get him in the car," Rollins barked. "We need to go now." Michael didn't need to be told twice. He helped John into the back seat of the nearest vehicle, slamming the door shut behind him. "All units fall back," Rollins commanded through the comms. The agents piled into the SUVs, engines roaring to life as they sped away from the warehouse. The sound of sirens echoed faintly in the distance. The police were closing in to finish what Michael and Rollins had started. In the back seat of the speeding SUV, Michael glanced over at John, who was leaning back against the seat, eyes half closed. He looked exhausted but relieved, as if he could finally believe that this nightmare was over. John's voice was raspy when he spoke. "You didn't have to do this." Michael met his gaze, his expression steady. "Yes, I did." John gave a weak chuckle, though it sounded more like a sigh. "Why?" Michael's answer was simple. "Because your family needs you." John stared at him for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, a shared understanding, the kind that only comes from men who know what it means to fight for what matters. Finally, John nodded, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. "Thank you," he whispered. Michael gave him a small nod in return, but his mind was already turning toward what came next. Victor might have escaped tonight, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The SUV sped through the city streets, heading toward safety. Michael glanced down at his phone, scrolling through messages from his contacts. They had John, but the war with Victor was just beginning, and Michael knew it would take everything they had to keep the Johnson family safe. The tension in the hotel room was suffocating. Jennifer sat on the edge of the bed, fidgeting with the worn edges of the book her father had given her years ago. She had tried to stay calm, but her heart was racing, and every passing second felt like an eternity. Her mother, Sarah, lay back against the pillows, visibly weaker but alert, her eyes fixed on the door. Both of them waited, hardly daring to breathe. Jennifer's thoughts swirled uncontrollably. What if something went wrong? What if her father wasn't okay? Michael had promised, but promises didn't always survive reality. She glanced at her mother, whose fingers were clutching the blanket like it was the only thing keeping her steady. Then, the door opened. For a moment, neither Jennifer nor Sarah moved. It was as if they didn't believe what they were seeing. John Johnson, standing in the doorway, alive but different. He looked older, thinner, and battered. His eyes, once sharp and full of focus, now carried a weight that spoke of everything he had endured. But he was there. He was alive. Jennifer was the first to react. The book slipped from her hands, forgotten, as she shot to her feet and sprinted toward him. "Dad!" she cried, her voice cracking as she threw herself into his arms with all the strength her small body could muster. John stumbled slightly from the force of her embrace, but he caught her, wrapping his arms around her tightly. His breath hitched as he held his daughter for the first time in what felt like an eternity. He buried his face in her hair, and for the first time since his captivity, the walls inside him crumbled. "Jennifer," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I've missed you so much." Jennifer clung to him fiercely, her small arms locked around his waist like she was afraid he might disappear if she let go. I thought you weren't coming back." John pulled back just enough to cup her face in his hands, his thumb brushing away the tears that had already started to spill down her cheeks. "I'm here now," he whispered. "And I'm never leaving again." Behind them, Sarah let out a soft, choked sound, a mix of relief and disbelief. She tried to push herself up from the bed, but her body was still too weak. "John," she whispered, her voice barely audible. John's eyes met hers, and everything else in the room seemed to fall away. He crossed the space between them in a few long strides, kneeling by the bed as he reached for her trembling hand. Sarah. Tears streamed silently down Sarah's face as she grasped his hand with both of hers, holding on like a lifeline. She had spent so many nights imagining this moment, fearing it would never come. Now that he was here, she didn't know what to say. John leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There were no words that could undo the pain, no way to fill the empty space that had grown between them during his absence. But in that silent touch, they said everything that needed to be said. "I thought I lost you," Sarah finally whispered, her voice breaking. John shook his head, his grip on her hand tightening. "You never did. I fought to come back to you." Jennifer, still standing beside them, wiped her face with the sleeve of her hoodie. She sniffled, but a small shaky smile appeared on her face as she watched her parents reunite. John shifted his gaze back to her, his heart swelling with pride and sorrow at the same time. "You've grown so much, kiddo." Jennifer gave a watery laugh, wiping her nose again. "You missed a lot." John's lips curled into a smile, but there was a sadness in it, a sadness for all the birthdays, school days, and small moments he hadn't been there for. "I'm sorry, Jen," he whispered, brushing her hair back from her face. "I'm so sorry." "It's okay," Jennifer replied quickly, shaking her head. "You're here now. That's all that matters." John exhaled, a breath he felt like he had been holding for years. He pulled both Sarah and Jennifer into a fierce embrace, holding them as tightly as he could without hurting them. He didn't care how long they stayed like that. He needed to feel them, to know that they were real, and that he was finally home. "I love you both," he murmured, his voice breaking. "More than anything." Sarah closed her eyes, resting her head on his shoulder, tears still slipping down her face. There had been so much fear, so much uncertainty, but now in John's arms, she felt safe again. Jennifer nestled into her father's side, the steady rise and fall of his chest reassuring her in a way words never could. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the three of them were together. And for that moment, nothing else mattered. Michael stood just outside the door, his hands resting in his coat pockets. He had no intention of intruding, this was their moment, and they deserved it. But hearing the muffled voices and quiet sobs from inside, he allowed himself a small, rare smile. He knew the fight wasn't over, Victor was still out there, and the storm brewing on the horizon was far from finished. But tonight, they had won something precious, a family reunited. And that was worth everything. With a final glance at the door, Michael turned and walked down the hall, already planning the next steps in his mind. Victor Blackwood sat at the small metal table inside the interrogation room, his hands shackled, the fluorescent light above casting harsh shadows across his sharp, expressionless face. He looked as calm as ever, despite the chains on his wrists. If the weight of his empire crumbling around him bothered him, he didn't show it. Michael stood on the other side of the glass, watching Victor through the two-way mirror. Rollins leaned against the wall beside him, arms crossed, studying the same scene. "I've seen a lot of bastards go down," Rollins muttered. "But this one? He doesn't look worried at all." Michael's jaw tightened. That was the thing about men like Victor, they never panicked. Even when the walls were closing in, they acted like they were still in control. "That's because he still thinks he can get out of this," Michael said, his eyes fixed on Victor. Rollins gave a low chuckle. Not this time. Michael wasn't as certain. Victor had spent years building his network, a web of corrupt officials, blackmail material, and blood money. Taking him down had been like pulling weeds. Cutting one only revealed more hiding beneath the surface. But this time, they had everything. With John's testimony and the evidence they recovered from the warehouse, Victor's empire was finished. "You ready?" Rollins asked. Michael gave a curt nod. "Let's finish this." The door to the interrogation room swung open, and Michael stepped inside, his calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions brewing beneath the surface. Victor didn't flinch or even look up. He sat perfectly still, as if this were just another meeting. "Mr. Blackwood," Michael began, pulling out the chair across from him and sitting down slowly. Victor's lips curled into a small, amused smile. "Mr. Thompson. Always such a pleasure." Michael ignored the sarcasm. Victor's charm was a weapon, just like his threats. He wouldn't play into it. "It's over," Michael said flatly. "The cops have everything. Bank records, informants, witness statements. John's testimony alone is enough to bury you." Victor tilted his head slightly, as if Michael were a child explaining something obvious. You think I didn't prepare for this? Victor leaned back in his chair, the cuffs clinking against the metal table. Men like me don't just go down because of paperwork. Michael's eyes remained cold. You're not walking out of here, Victor. Not this time. Victor chuckled softly, the sound low and smug. I admire your confidence, Michael. Really, I do. But you should know by now, people like me, we always have a way out. Michael leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. His voice was steady, deliberate. Your money is frozen. Your contacts have flipped. And your leverage. He gave a small, grim smile. It's worthless now. Everyone you threatened is either in custody or protected. For the first time, a flicker of something, annoyance, maybe frustration, flashed across Victor's face. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual mask of control. You think that means anything? Victor asked, raising an eyebrow. You cut off one head, and another takes its place. Maybe, Michael admitted. But it won't be yours. Victor's smile faltered, just a little. He knew the game was finally over. Outside the room, Rollins tapped on the glass, signaling to the officers waiting in the hallway. Get him processed, Rollins said to one of the guards. I want him booked and behind bars before he even thinks about calling a lawyer. 2 officers entered the room, moving to Victor's side. For the first time, the faintest edge of tension appeared in Victor's posture. This isn't over, Thompson, Victor muttered as the officers yanked him to his feet. You'll see. Men like me don't stay down for long. Michael stood, unbothered. You'll have plenty of time to think about that where you're going. Victor shot him one last glare before the officers escorted him out, the sound of metal cuffs scraping against steel echoing through the room. For a man who had once ruled through fear, it was a humiliating end. With Victor gone, Michael stepped out into the hallway, where Rollins was waiting. So that's it? Rollins asked, folding his arms. After everything, the bastard just goes quietly. Michael gave a small shrug. He'll try to fight it. They always do. You think he'll make a deal? Michael's expression darkened. Not with what we've got on him. Rollins grinned. Good. I hope he rots. Michael didn't respond. The fight might be over, but the damage Victor had caused would take a long time to heal. Still, this was a victory, one he knew John and his family desperately needed. Later that day, Michael met with John in a small conference room at the precinct. John looked better, still tired and worn, but with a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. He was no longer a prisoner, no longer trapped in Victor's web. It's done, Michael said, sitting across from him. Victor's locked up. They're processing the charges now. John exhaled slowly, as if a weight he had carried for too long had finally been lifted. I didn't think I'd live to see this day, John admitted, rubbing a hand over his face. Thank you, Michael. For everything. Michael gave a small nod. You don't have to thank me. You earned this. John leaned back, his gaze distant for a moment. I want to finish what I started, you know? I want to keep fighting. People like Victor. They don't stop. We can't either. Michael studied him for a moment, then gave a rare smile. Then I'll help you. John blinked, caught off guard. You will. Victor was just one piece of the puzzle, Michael said, his voice low but determined. There's more out there. And if you want to keep going, you'll have my support. Whatever you need. John smiled for the first time in what felt like years, a genuine, grateful smile. We'll do it right this time, John said quietly. Michael nodded. They had won this battle, but the war against corruption wasn't over. And this time, John wouldn't have to fight it alone. It had been a few weeks since the dust had settled. The scars from everything they had endured were still there, but so was the hope, the quiet, cautious kind that grows when you finally believe things can get better. The Johnson family was rebuilding their lives, one day at a time. Sarah's health was improving steadily with proper medical care. John was adjusting to being home, reconnecting with his wife and daughter while slowly finding a way back to himself. Jennifer had returned to school, though her heart still carried the weight of everything they had gone through. She was no longer just a little girl. Something inside her had changed forever. One afternoon, as Sarah and Jennifer sat in the living room, a knock echoed through the front door. I'll get it, Jennifer called, hopping off the couch and hurrying toward the door. When she opened it, there stood Michael, dressed as sharply as ever but with a relaxed air about him. In his hands, he held a neatly wrapped package, tied with a simple ribbon. "Michael!" Jennifer exclaimed, surprised but delighted to see him. Michael gave her a small smile and held out the package. "This belongs to you." Jennifer hesitated, eyeing the shape of the package. It was unmistakable, the book. "But I sold it to you," she whispered, her brows knitting in confusion. Michael's smile widened just a fraction, a rare warmth flickering in his eyes. "Think of it as a loan," he said softly. "It was always meant to come back to you." Jennifer carefully unwrapped the package, and there it was, the familiar worn leather cover, with the creases exactly where her fingers used to rest. She ran her hand over the surface, her heart swelling with emotion. "I thought I'd never see it again," she whispered, holding the book close to her chest. For a moment, she stood frozen, overwhelmed by the significance of the gesture. Then, without a second thought, she launched herself forward and wrapped her arms around Michael. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Michael returned the hug briefly, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. "You did most of it yourself," he said quietly. "You're stronger than you know." Jennifer pulled back, wiping her eyes but smiling through her tears. "What now?" she asked, tilting her head. Michael gave her a knowing look. "Now." He straightened slightly. "Now, you keep being brave. Keep moving forward. You've got a bright future, Jennifer." Jennifer nodded, absorbing his words with the seriousness of someone much older. "I'll try," she whispered. "You will," Michael corrected gently, with a confidence that made her believe him. Sarah, who had been watching the exchange from the doorway, stepped closer. "Thank you, Michael," she said, her voice full of quiet gratitude. "You've given us more than we ever thought possible." Michael gave her a small nod. "You don't owe me anything. Just take care of each other." John appeared in the hallway behind his wife, leaning against the wall with a subtle smile. His eyes met Michael's, and though no words were exchanged, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a mutual respect between two men who had fought through darkness and come out the other side. "You ever need anything," John said, his voice steady, "you know where to find us." Michael gave him a slight nod. "I know." He turned to Jennifer one last time. "Take care of that book," he said with a small grin. "It has more value than you realize." Jennifer smiled, holding the book even closer. "I will." With that, Michael gave a final nod to the family and turned toward the door. As he walked down the front steps and into the quiet street beyond, Jennifer stood at the doorway, watching him leave. She didn't say anything, but something inside her shifted. That brief encounter with Michael had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The world could be harsh, full of loss and uncertainty, but it could also be filled with moments of kindness, of people who showed up when you needed them most. And that was the lesson she would carry forward. There would always be shadows in life, but there would also be light, if you knew where to look for it. Jennifer glanced down at the book in her hands, feeling its familiar weight. It wasn't just a reminder of her father, or of what they had lost. It was a symbol of everything they had survived, and of the future still waiting for them. With a deep breath, she turned back into the house, where her parents waited for her. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to find out.
If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.